Hi, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon for any of you on the West Coast. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up, just want to make sure. Okay, great. Well, it is so nice to welcome all of you to this webinar. This is going to be an evening of very exciting education, and we're going to be learning about drug policy. Our webinar is entitled Navigating the Legal Psychedelics Path, Progress, Delays, and Harm Reduction in Drug Reform. And this is organized in partnership with Plant Medicine Law Group, and we are Doctors for Drug Policy Reform. And just a brief note on our groups, Doctors for Drug Policy Reform used to be called Doctors for Cannabis Reform. And in October, we rebranded to include the expansion of psychedelics. And we're an international group of healthcare providers and scientists advocating for the sensible drug policy that's based on scientific evidence and advocating for principles of equity and harm reduction in drug policy reform. And the Plant Medicine Law Group, they are a law firm that is dedicated to helping companies and healthcare providers build psychedelic infrastructure. And so this is the exact kind of collaboration that we need to help move things forward. So very excited to welcome you all tonight. My name is Kristel Carrington. I am a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and a psychedelic assisted therapist. And I joined the board of Doctors for Drug Policy Reform last year and doing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy treatments for some time, and just seeing the power of psychedelic medicine, I grew obsessed with the regulatory and legal space, trying to understand what the holdup was, given all the evidence we have. And I connected with D4DPR, and it's been helpful to feel like I can channel my frustration into some form of action to advance this goal. And we have with us tonight an excellent, exciting panel of experts on psychedelic legislation. We have Brad Bartlett. He is a Colorado-based corporate attorney, mediator, litigator, and policy advisor with experience in the areas of psychedelic, medical, environmental, and American Indian law. He's counseled American Indian nations, medical doctors, and therapists working with new psychedelic companies. Communities also impacted by fossil energy extraction, as well as companies complying with FDA guidelines and procuring DEA licensing. He earned his JD from the Colorado School of Law and is a member of the bar in Colorado and Georgia, and is of counsel in the Plant Medicine Law Group as well. And I should note that the Plant Medicine Law Group, Adriana Kurtzer is the founder and principal, and she is also on the board of D4DPR. We also have Tamar Todd. She is an attorney with expertise in policy advocacy, legislative drafting, statewide political campaign strategy, regulatory implementation, and nonprofit management in the areas of drug law reform, public health, and criminal justice. She has drafted numerous state and local ballot initiatives and statutes, and has testified in numerous legislative and government bodies in the US and abroad on the issue of drug policy and the intersection of state and federal law. She currently teaches a course on marijuana law and policy at Berkeley. Casey Homan is a business attorney at Emerge Law Group. She was a member of the drafting team for Oregon Measure 109, which legalized psilocybin services in Oregon, and serves as co-chair of Emerge Law Group's Psychedelics Practice Group. Casey also serves as chair of the Oregon State Bar's Cannabis and Psychedelics Law section. Casey is licensed to practice law in Oregon, Colorado, and New Jersey. And we have Juliana Mulligan. She is a psychotherapist who was formerly opioid dependent and now in recovery, formerly incarcerated, and has been working in the ibogaine treatment field for 11 years. She has a master's in social work from NYU, was recently a consultant for the Kentucky Ibogaine Initiative, and she teaches and writes extensively on the topics of ibogaine, psychedelics for substance use, and psychedelics for substance use issues. She runs Inner Vision Ibogaine, which supports people in the preparation and integration around ibogaine treatment, and offers consulting services. She is also on the advisory board for Shine Collective, which is a organization that focuses on abuse prevention, survivor support, and ethical standards in the psychedelic field. So welcome, welcome, welcome to this fascinating group of experts. So this is how the evening is going to go. I am going to give a very brief presentation to help contextualize how we got here today, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists for some comments, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to start us off with a very brief timeline. And this is really to help us understand the key moments in the history of drug policy that brought us where we are today. I cannot ever capture the complexity of this history, but I think it's important that we reflect on the intersection of political perceptions, public perceptions, political shifts, and scientific breakthroughs. I also want us to reflect on language, because when we think about education, perception, and how messages are conveyed, we need to remember the power of language and its influence on how policies are formed. And the insights from our panelists, I think, will help us understand those intersections and what we can maybe look forward to in the years to come. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about psychedelics. It means mind revealing, soul manifesting, and psychedelics induce altered states of consciousness, and they induce profound changes in mood, thought, perception. They do cause auditory and visual hallucinations, which is a part of the therapeutic effects. And they create what's called the mystical experience, because they induce feelings of awe and connectedness. And this can lead to really deep introspective insights and personal growth. Here's examples of the most commonly known psychedelics. And in recent years, we've seen an explosion of research that has shown how beneficial these medicines are for practically, most of our mental health conditions, including anxiety, depression, PTSD, and substance use disorders. And given the state of our mental health care in this country, it's nice to know that we have something that can shift the paradigm. However, we don't have access to it because it's illegal. So how do we get here? Psychedelics are nothing new. They're some of the most ancient medicines known to humanity. And well before the Western world knew them, they were used safely and ethically and carefully in ancient indigenous societies for both treatment of physical and spiritual illness. And these plant medicines were embedded in the fabric of the culture. And that's a stark difference to the heavy-handed approach of criminalizing and strictly controlling drugs in the US. And this anti-drug attitude, this prohibition policy, it started in 1914 with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. And it criminalized the non-medical use of opiates and cocaine, and it laid the foundation for federal drug control. It aimed to strike a balance between medical use and preventing misuse. So this actually also created a shift in medical practice, because it imposed restrictions on how physicians could manage medications that were opiates or cocaine. An important Supreme Court case that I wanted to mention in this context is Webb versus United States. Dr. Webb was a physician that prescribed morphine for a patient with opioid use disorder, and he prescribed it for maintenance treatment. And the Supreme Court upheld his conviction because they determined that maintenance treatment was not treatment. Treatment for withdrawal was considered treatment, but this ruling effectively criminalized opioid maintenance treatment. And thankfully, we don't have that concern today, but it's important to see how the courts played a role in these policies moving forward. These are some New York Times covers from that time period. And it's important just to highlight, again, how language is used to identify use of these substances with certain groups, and also spark fear in the public, which justifies the level of penalties that people get. And it wasn't until this gentleman, Gordon Wasson, he went to Mexico in the 1950s and met Maria Sabina, who was a Mazatec shaman, and she introduced him to a psychedelic mushroom ceremony. And after this experience, he published an article in Life magazine and pretty much introduced psychedelics to the world. Now, the 50s to the 70s, this is really the psychedelic Renaissance period. Here we see the term psychedelic was actually first coined in 1956, and the research community became utterly fascinated by psychedelics and their ability to have some potential benefits for mental health and substance use disorders. So here we see the first iterations of psychedelic-assisted therapy. But I'm going to have to call out some of the ethical breaches, because we have here this is Timothy Leary on the left in this picture with the two gentlemen, and that is Richard Alpert on the right. And they were two Harvard scientists that performed LSD experiments on their students, and they were eventually kicked out because there was no proper informed consent. They didn't tell the students what they were taking. And psychedelic therapy, it might be, it has a lesser known history that it was used as conversion therapy for homosexual and bisexual individuals. And so when we're thinking about the psychedelic renaissance, the popular media was experiencing its own discovery. And so we have influence on music, art, culture, literature, film, and this defined the counterculture period. When we think about how things shifted, the language of fear and stigma became amplified. We have Mr. Leary here with his famous slogan, turn on, tune in, drop out, which was something that caused some societal concern. This is also during a period of civil rights protests. We have the Cold War, anti-communism concerns, we have the Vietnam War protests, and we have a whole generation of people questioning authority and questioning the current social norms. And so all of this was seen as antithetical to traditional American values. And it becomes convenient to depict certain groups as a moral threat to social order. And in this context, we can thank Nixon for really propelling us into the situation we have today with the war on drugs. So he considered drugs public enemy number one. And in 1970, the Controlled Substance Act was passed. And it was a system for regulating the importation, distribution, and possession of controlled substances. But this time, what it did was create a scheduling classification system for the substances, which basically grouped them into categories of medical use and risk of harm. And so this administration was, again, the spark that lit the flame that we're going to continue seeing shortly. Just to give you a sense of Schedule 1 through 5. So as you can see, Schedule 1, marijuana, LSD, MDMA, psilocybin are on there, meaning that they have high abuse potential and little medical use. You can take a peek through the rest of the table. You can see in Schedule 4, Xanax, Valium, Ambien. Given my clinical experience, I would confidently argue that those are a little bit more addictive than what we have listed in Schedule 1. And on the bottom, I had to note that tobacco, alcohol, and opiates are all legal, and they kill the most people in this country every year. And then the war intensifies. So in the 80s, during the Reagan era, we have the Just Say No campaign, and that was a heavy-handed educational campaign targeted to young people, again, with the theme of prohibition and that drugs would kill you, cause you to commit murder, and various other acts of violence. We also saw the passing of the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 86 and 88, and here is where we see the harsh penalties for pretty minor and nonviolent drug offenses. We see the mandatory sentencing, and we also see heavy policing in minority communities. And Nixon through Reagan's administration led to the dramatic increase in the prison population. So here we see an example that many of you might remember. This is your brain on drugs. And that was an example of the kind of messages that were seen and marketed to the public. Nothing about harm reduction. And so thinking about when he started the war on drugs, you can see that there was a dramatic increase in the prison population during this time. In the 1990s, we see signs of the Renaissance to come. MDMA in 85 was placed on Schedule 1, and then in 86, Rick Doblin started MAPS, which has pioneered the legalization of MDMA, hopefully impending this year. And in 1994, the FDA actually approved a study on DMT. And so DMT was actually the very first psychedelic that was legally tested on a human in a research setting. In 94, we also see an amendment to the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and that's what protected the use of peyote by members of the Native American Church. And in 96, California legalized marijuana for medical use through the Compassionate Use Act. In the 2000s to the 2010s, I would say it's characterized by acknowledging failure, and the psychedelic renaissance is gaining some momentum. So we acknowledge that the war on drugs is a failure and has made public health worse. And thinking about the AIDS epidemic, the opioid crisis, and our ongoing mental health crisis, public perception has gradually shifted from one of punishment to treatment and harm reduction. And of course, social media has definitely made a big influence on how we view drug policy and the education we get today. So in terms of the modern renaissance, we're seeing big shifts and milestones. So the FDA granted breakthrough therapy status to MDMA and psilocybin. MAPS has come out with its second phase 3 study for MDMA-assisted therapy, showing superior efficacy of MDMA as compared with standard treatments for PTSD. And the significance of a second phase 3 study means that you can apply for the FDA for a new drug application. We've seen increase in advocacy groups, an explosion of industry, media, culture, celebs all talking about psychedelics. And in general, there's been an increased integration and cultural acceptance. And thinking about language and the identity of the user, we see that veterans are a trusted group that when we consider the treatment of their conditions with psychedelics, it's a little bit more palatable given the stigma that they once held. Major milestones as of the past few years, again, mentioned Oregon, it passed Measure 109 in 2020. And in 2022, Colorado passed Proposition 122. And both of these are frameworks for a regulated system of facilitated psilocybin services. And they're the first two to actually do something like this. So this is a very pivotal moment in the history. And it's also something that I think will spark other states creating similar legislation. This is a graph from a well-known website, Psychedelic Alpha, that tracks drug policy. And the main categorizations that we're seeing are policies for decrim, working groups to study the use, reducing penalty statutes, and of course, legalization and regulation. One other big milestone is that we have bipartisan support. You know, Republicans and Democrats are advocating for the use of psychedelics. So that's something that could push things forward a little sooner, but our panelists will help us understand that complex interplay. And so when we think about this year and beyond, MDMA likely to be approved for PTSD. And given that it's an election year, very interesting election year, it's hard to know what might happen once one of these candidates are in office. But now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, and I think they'd be able to speak to how some of the intersections of perceptions and language and scientific breakthroughs, how it all influences the policies that we are trying to advance today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And so with our panelists, I was hoping that just to start, could each of you share maybe 3 to 5 minutes how your personal and professional experience has shaped your understanding of these intersections, policy, perception, language, and scientific breakthroughs? Tamar, how about we start with you?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having me. I come from a long history in drug policy reform and spent a lot of time on cannabis law reform. And as you mentioned in my bio, I really studied the intersection of state and federal law and the constraints around that and how that shaped cannabis. And a lot of those lessons are very applicable here. I also work in sort of a policy movement context, and my focus is primarily on state policy pathways to legal access. So I'm involved in a number of the bills that you mentioned there at the very end, in terms of drafting legislation and drafting potential ballot initiatives on state and local level. And so my orientation is grappling with those legal issues, but also figuring out the intersection of like what we can move and what can pass. So as you, in your chart at the end there, there's many models of reform. I think there's maybe 28 different pending bills in states. And when you look at why are states looking at those different models and why are some models moving in some place and some others, I think there's a number of factors to look at there that are important to understand. One is obviously the policy priorities of the lawmakers. As you mentioned, it's a bipartisan issue. There's also folks coming to it from different angles and reasons. There's different interests of stakeholders at the table. And then there's the politics of the state, what's viable in the legislature with the specific governor, with the voters in that state. And then a big piece that I obviously am always like overlaying on all the legislation I look at is the limitations of federal law and what states can actually do and can't do on their own without running afoul of federal law legally or triggering federal enforcement. So for example, states can clearly remove state law penalties and can issue state licenses and state registrations for conduct that will then not be penalized under state law, but still is illegal under federal law. They cannot reschedule psychedelics under the CSA. They can't remove federal penalties for psychedelics. And they can't, I think, critically, and this is where we see a lot of allow physicians to prescribe Schedule I substances that are illegal under federal law. And it's sort of a question how much involvement those professionals could have. So with medical cannabis, they recommended, but weren't involved to a greater degree. And here we have a question about whether, there can be a more medicalized role there. So those limits are often directing and shaping the policy in a way that doesn't drive the best policy outcome. That's like if you had one cohesive body looking at it and coming up with something, but it's the state and the federal government sort of crosshairs with each other sometimes that drives it. You covered, there's a lot of variety of bills, study commissions, funding for clinical research, decriminalization, regulation and decriminalization, a medical framework that allows just for either certain categories of people, veterans, first responders, healthcare workers, or people with certain medical diagnoses or conditions. All sorts of models passing. Some of them are going to pass. Some of them are going to pass and be unimplementable. And, I think state and regulators and drug policy reformers will look at what passes and see and learn from the other states. I just want to touch quick. Do you want me to quit and move on to someone else for questions?
I think Brad can actually can speak to what you're saying. So I'm just wondering,
Okay.
Brad, if you could share just a few of your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Carrington. It's an honor to be here, and thanks for the invite. And this is a great panel. Where would you like me to pick up? I'm happy to jump in. I'm also happy to talk about my own experience. So you tell me where you'd like me to start.
Okay. Just a few minutes about your insights with these intersections and things you sort of learned and gleaned, and how, perception, policy, scientific breakthroughs, how it's informed your interactions, and sort of what you're taking away from those things and how things will move forward in 2024 and beyond.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let me just start with my own personal journey with all of this. And, I've been practicing law now for 25 years. And one of my mentors when I went to law school was a gentleman by the name of Walter Echohawk, who worked for the Native American Rights Fund. And I think, I was 2 years into law school. And prior to that, he had major success working with Reuben Snake and passing the American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments of 1996, which legalized peyote at the federal level for religious exercise by members of federally recognized Indian tribes. And that really, was a pretty big deal to get that passed and to have that right secured by an act of Congress. Because prior to that time, it was protected by a regulation through the Drug Enforcement Administration. But that kind of set my journey in motion. And, I've had the honor of representing American Indian communities throughout my career, and have worn many different hats over the years. When Colorado legalized marijuana, I was actually teaching law school at the time and decided that I would jump ship and move into a big cannabis business law firm, because I've had a lifelong personal relationship with marijuana. So it very much interested me as to how this act was going to play out in the real world. And, we had the good fortune of having the Obama administration in power at the time. So that really, I think, lent itself to not seeing a very heavy-handed federal enforcement by the federal government. And I think everyone looking back from this vantage point right now in 2024, we can say that those state experiments, those states' rights experiments, were tremendous success, right? And, I think we're doing the same thing now in the state here in Colorado, but also, Oregon obviously was the first one out of the starting gate 2 years ago with legalizing psilocybin. I think Colorado's painted with a broader brush, and we've added some other natural medicines to that palette. But I'm very optimistic that these state right experiments are going to be just as successful as marijuana. They're different, and we can get into that and why they are different and why it's important to treat these substances differently. But I do see good things with these models going forward. So.
Thank you so much for that. Juliana, I would love to hear from you and your thoughts, because you're coming from a more clinical standpoint. So it'd be great to hear how you've experienced all of these changes.
Yeah, sure. I first want to just mention, whenever I'm thinking about the history of drug policy, I always think about the famous John L. Richmond quote, which John L. Richmond was one of the chief aides to Nixon. And the quote he gave in the mid-90s was that in the late 60s, they needed a way to target Black people in the anti-war left. And what better way to do that than the war on drugs? And he said, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And so I want to point this out to say that the war on drugs is a racist war, and it is an anti-left and fascist war. And when that quote came out, it should have upended the whole DEA and the whole drug scheduling system, and it didn't. So we're still dealing with a racially motivated system. And what I see happening in drug policy is something being created that's going to benefit privileged people. And not everyone. There are people that are focused on equity and access. But I just want to mention this to say that this movement has to be about deconstructing white supremacy and colonization and oppressive narratives so that these medicines are going to be accessible for all. In terms of my experience, and yeah, I'm coming from a clinical standpoint, and I never thought I would be involved in research or policy up until a few years ago when the head of the Opioid Abatement Commission in Kentucky contacted me because he wanted to use opioid lawsuit funds to fund Ibogaine research. So that was really exciting. And even though that effort failed because of political reasons and pharmaceutical interests in Kentucky not wanting something like this to go ahead, that is not happening at the moment, although it still might. And so right now what's going on with Ibogaine is there are 10 states in the US that are interested in using opioid abatement funds to fund Ibogaine clinical trials, which is very exciting. It is an effort has never been made to only use public funds in this way to fund a clinical trial. Usually there has to be a drug development company involved, but there's a group of us working to make a generic Ibogaine from purely public funds. I don't know if we're going to be able to pull this off. We're going to try. In the process, I've been learning about other efforts from drug development companies who are looking to create like a patented version to push through clinical trials. And so I'm learning what's going on, but what I'm seeing is that really creating a generic version is going to be the best thing in terms of equity and access. The thing about Ibogaine, and for a long time I thought, forget about research, forget about the FDA process, let's just improve treatment as it is internationally, which there are Ibogaine clinics, maybe 70 to 90 around the world, most of them operating in a legal gray area with no regulation or oversight, aside from Sao Paulo state in Brazil and New Zealand. Everywhere else, and most of the highest concentration of clinics are in Mexico, and they're all operating without any kind of supervision, way to report incidents, any kickback if something negative were to happen. And so we have, I would say my estimate is 90% of these clinics are not run safely. And because Ibogaine has some serious cardiac side effects, it must be done under medical supervision. And so what I realized after working in the field for about 12 years is that we actually need the research to happen in the US to set a clinical standard so that it will actually improve treatment around the world when we have this standardized training process, supervision process, and approval process in place. I don't think that approval in the US is going to stop the legal gray area clinics from running. I think their business is just going to keep going up. but I think doing it here is going to make it safer, and hopefully we'll have access for people who can't leave the country and can't travel in that way. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just a bit about the process. And also I want to mention there is some ibogaine history. It actually was approved for a phase 1 study in 1993. Subjects were recruited, and then the FDA called it off with no real explanation. It's reported that it was over intellectual property disputes, but ibogaine's been something that's knocking at the door for a long time. And I think it's really tricky to get something like this passed because it is essentially a one-time treatment for the most part. And that's not something that generally gets approved in this country. So I'm seeing a lot of barriers in terms of pharmaceutical interests, in terms of the influence of pharmaceutical companies on the FDA, and so forth.
Thank you so much for that. And that's a very helpful contextualization for what's happening on the scientific end, because pharmaceutical industries are certainly putting in a lot of investment in not only making psychedelic drugs, but making different versions of them that they can patent and hold patents for many, many years. So that definitely creates some delays in terms of development and
access.
And access, absolutely. And Casey, yes, would love to hear your thoughts on all of this, how you've noticed scientific breakthroughs, the attitudes of the politicians, and just what's been your experience kind of weeding around in these intersections and navigating them.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I am fascinated by what everyone else has said before me, such intelligent minds speaking today, and I'm honored to be among you all. I think, you know, my wading into this area has really been by happenstance. My grandparents owned head shops in Oklahoma City, where I grew up. And so I grew up in this really cannabis-friendly family that normalized healthy drug use. And similar to what you were saying, Kristel, at the beginning, like, why has the law not caught up with the research? I found that once I kind of left my parents' house, the narrative around drugs out in the world just didn't align with the narrative that I had been taught in my family throughout my life. And that was always a big question mark to me, was why we were, you know, stigmatizing things that could be beneficial for people. And there's so much, you know, science and research to support those claims. And so everything I do, you know, as a business attorney, as weird as it sounds, kind of aligns with my fundamental belief in bodily autonomy. And I think my work in this space over the past 5 or 6 years has just taught me that there's a lot of facets to drug policy reform, many pathways to access, and people in general just have such different relationships and fears and experiences with drugs. And I think educating the public and teaching people about the value of drugs in their lives, or non-use of drugs, if that's what works for them, is super informative and leaves people realizing that what they've taught is mostly wrong. So I think when I think about my time in this space, you know, I don't think I can just be a lawyer in this space. What I found is that, you know, I have to be an educator, and being a lawyer is a lot like being an educator in some ways, and a lot like being a counselor. And so I feel like there's a million things I could say on the legal side of this, but I'm just going to leave it at that and let you get into any questions that you might have that are more like specifically directed at us.
Wonderful. Yes, I would love for us to jump into the Q&A. And before I start that, I just want everyone to sort of think about what they want to take away from this. For me, when I was co-organizing this event, I was thinking about all the different ways in which, again, these things come together, all of the intersections. And when we see such a large goal and obstacle ahead of us, I think it makes it hard to remember that we have to celebrate the small wins along the way. And so for me, coming away from this, I'd like to definitely feel like I have an action item in mind, whether it's something small, something big, but if I can contribute to a small win, that's still an impact. So I'm hoping that all of you leave here not only informed, but also feeling like, okay, there's something I can do to contribute to a small win. So with that, let's just sort of take a peek and see if we have any questions. Okay, looks like we don't have any particular questions yet, but one question I definitely have for all of you, and you know, anyone can jump in, your experience of the perceptions and attitudes amongst the decision makers, whether it be in the regulatory FDA, DEA space, or the legislative space, working with senators, governors, whatever it might be, but just getting a sense of what have you felt coming from them, and what concerns or hope do you have from that?
I'd be happy to speak to this from a kind of Oregon perspective to start us off. One thing that I've noticed, so in Oregon, the Oregon Health Authority is the regulatory agency that governs Oregon's psilocybin program. They're a health agency. They're very safety oriented. That is their purpose as a health agency. But they have taken a really conservative approach to psilocybin in Oregon. In my opinion, maybe overregulated the space. There are just ridiculous number of documents, a ridiculous number of regulations. And, to Juliana's point, every single regulation has the downstream effect of adding cost to business operators and to patients, clients who need services. And that has really driven up the cost of services in Oregon. It obviously creates a huge barrier to access. And although I've seen a lot of scholarships and sliding scale payments being implemented by service centers and facilitators in Oregon to try to mitigate that, at the end of the day, they're operating businesses, and they have to, pay extremely high licensing fees. They have to pay attorneys to help them create these complicated business structures. There's just a lot involved that ultimately creates a barrier to access. And I think a lot of that starts with regulatory agencies. And I'll be really curious to see how Colorado approaches that, and if they are going to try to take a little bit of be safety oriented, of course, because they have to, but be a little bit more careful about, the implications that has on licensees.
Thank you. It is very expensive. I think it's $10,000 for a license for a manufacturer, and I think that's a yearly cost, and they can't claim that on their business taxes because it's a Schedule 1. So it's all leaving. Anyone else can speak to the attitudes or things you've experienced?
I can share a little bit. Back in September, there's this special caucus focused on psychedelics in DC, where they're doing educational sessions for senators on psychedelics. And I was invited to speak. And surprisingly, there were a lot of very interested Republican senators that were in attendance to this meeting. And afterwards, we were taken around to meet with people individually. And I was surprised to find that once you got into the science and the evidence, and also hearing from someone who used Ibogaine for opioids like myself, they were very open and excited about psychedelic therapy on both sides, Democrat and Republican. So that felt really promising. I know it's not that simple, and I know a lot of them are trained to give really smile and nod type responses. But just judging from the fact that as soon as Kentucky was announced, 10 states reached out to Kentucky to say, we want to do that too for Ibogaine. I think that's really promising. So
that's helpful. There's always has to be someone to take that first step. Okay, so we have some questions coming in. So we have one here. Do you think that the recent court case between the DEA and Ames wanting to use psilocybin for terminally ill cancer patients could create a judicial pathway to rescheduling?
Well, I'll jump in and speak to that one because I am familiar with the case and the lawyers litigating it. It won't create a judicial pathway. It could create a regulatory pathway to the extent DEA revisits the issue and decides it wants to take up rescheduling. I think right now it's been remanded back to the agency to basically explain its decision better. More often than not, when you see these types of administrative law cases, agencies are able pretty easily to paper things over, so whether they're going to just come up with the same decision all over again, probably yes, is what they're going to do. I think the most fruitful avenue right now when it comes to psychedelics is clearly the states' rights. Litigation is really this much of legalization. I don't think we're going to see the DEA take on a broad rescheduling of any drugs. I think that the two primary pathways we're going to see for legalization, states' rights and FDA clinical trials, taking something through clinical trials. And Dr. Carrington, as you mentioned at the top, we're very close right now with Lycos, which is the rebranding of MAP, potentially having a decision from the FDA in August of this year. So we're just going to have to wait and see. It is an election year. So, my sense is everything probably is just going to be pushed until after the election. I can't imagine we'll see the Biden administration doing much of anything. They'll just promise, hey, you vote for us and put us back in power. We swear we'll do this, right? That's what they're going to say come August. I can basically read the tea leaves in that. So again, what that tells us is these states experiments, the city decriminalization measures, this is where all the action is. There are other cases out there that are dealing with religious exercise, primarily in the context of ayahuasca. Those have really been spinning their wheels. There was an adverse decision out of the 11th Circuit with the Silverquest case that is, I think, going to have some cascading effects for other religious groups across the United States who are working with ayahuasca. And basically, I think everybody's going to be pushed into some type of petitioning process before the DEA if you want a religious exemption, just like everybody else. You're going to have to line up for a license from the DEA. According to the 11th Circuit, whether that gets challenged or there's a conflict in the circuits, we'll have to wait and see, because there are other cases in Arizona and district court that are working their way up. So we could get a split in the circuits. But right now, the law of the land really is, if you want to practice your religion at the federal level, you have to petition the DEA under the Controlled Substances Act to receive a religious exemption. No two ways about it. And that's a bitter pill to swallow for a lot of religious practitioners, I think. So hope that helps.
Tamar, I see you nodding. I'm wondering if you can share some thoughts.
I mean, I was just nodding in agreement that that's on it, but I don't have more to add on the litigation piece. You could go on to the next question.
Right. So I have a question from Tiffany Ashton Gatsby. Looking forward to approvals and scheduling changes, how long do you think it would take for Medicare and Medicaid to get on board to start covering treatment as medically necessary once things are finally signed off on the legal front? I have some thoughts on this, but I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, so I can give you guys some time.
No, please be a Debbie Downer. I know what answer you're about to say, because it's a Schedule I controlled substances. All of these substances are, you're not going to see Medicare and Medicaid stepping into this space to do funding anytime soon. Maybe that will change if you have some type of approval from the FDA for MDMA. But again, we're just going to have to wait and see how all this shakes out. So it's still going to be a very expensive therapy at the end of the day, even with FDA approval. So none of this is going to be cheap.
Yes. So I'm going to Debbie Down away. Don't hold your breath. It's going to be really expensive. And there are some groups that are advocating and trying to persuade Medicaid to cover it once some of these medicines are approved. And the reason they're targeting Medicaid and Medicare is if Medicaid and Medicare were to put that on their drug formularies, it's much harder for commercial insurance to justify not paying for it. But ultimately, even when MDMA is approved, I can't see private insurance paying for it. Like they're just not going to. They can do what they want. They're the gatekeepers of healthcare. And for anything that's a really expensive treatment, they're only going to be looking at the immediate, not the long-term cost effectiveness of actually helping people with their mental health. So we'll keep that.
I was gonna say, I agree that it's a long road. I mean, the one piece that I think we're trying to put in legislation, although I don't know if it materializes, is the possibility that there's pieces of the treatment or the therapy that could be covered that would otherwise be covered that don't involve the substance itself. So to the extent you have like preparation and integration and those components, and there's a therapeutic aspect to it or a therapist involved, that those pieces, so not the entire services could be covered, but there would be a way to sort of segment it and have parts covered. I don't know if that would, actually happen, but to me that seems like the only route right now to get parts of it potentially covered, particularly under like a state implementation of Medicaid type of model.
And I did forget to mention, there's also a push for a group therapy model for MDMA, because there was a recent study in an economics paper that said it would be cost effective, I think saving about $130 million over 30 years. So the group therapy model is also something that's being looked at, because you can treat multiple patients in one setting, because the MDMA protocol is 8 hours of a treatment session with one provider, and integration sessions, preparation sessions. So you're looking at a total of about 9 to 12 sessions where you're spending a significant amount of time, including the sessions with the medicine.
Can I just I just want to, like, it's kind of a question for the other panelists, but I'm working with a group of moms who've lost children to opioid overdose, who are planning on suing the DEA. They have multiple approaches that they want to take. And I'm just wondering what all of your thoughts are on that, on suing the DEA to deschedule some of these substances.
That's a good one.
I wouldn't say no. You can always push. I mean, litigation is a blunt instrument, and it's a tool in the toolbox, just like everything else. And it's just, if you think about making social change, right? It's one of those spokes in the wheels, just like everything else, right? And you can use it to get your message out there, to really press hard for it. The problem with the laws is that, the Controlled Substances Act was passed back in the 1970s. It is a very antiquated law, and it gives the DEA a lot of power and a lot of discretion. And unfortunately, and Dr. Carrington noted, it was, Nixon was president at the time, but Congress was controlled by Democrats at the time, right? So it was like bipartisan. So you have both parties that are responsible for the mess where you're in, 50 years later. And setting aside all the nonsense that went on in the 1980s with enforcement actions by the Reagan administration. So look, I would never talk anybody out of pursuing litigation. It's a great organizing strategy. It gives you something to rally around. It gives you something to talk about. It gives you something to hand to your representatives when you go meet with them and have those discussions. And, if you've got a good lawyer who's out there litigating your case, they can articulate what the case is about and what the legal change is you're hoping to gain, right? And it's just one avenue for gaining that legal change.
To that point, when we think about trying to convince politicians to make changes, something that's important in language is the language of money and the language of their constituents. So I'm just wondering if you guys had experience where using those arguments have been helpful to shift the gears, create a little bit more interest, excitement, and motivation when it comes to those particular aspects of speaking with politicians.
I mean, I'll just jump in here. My experience actually is that it's quite different from cannabis in that regard. Whereas like cannabis law reform, it was like, show me the money. Like that sounds like a great reason to do it. And it's going to be this big revenue generator. Here, money usually comes up in that, how is this program going to, how are we going to cover the costs of the program? And I don't think we should sell it as a revenue generator, because it is not. It's not. I think we should be emphasizing how it's quite different from cannabis. And we do have to grapple with, given the cost, like covering the cost of the program is a challenge. So I mean, going back to the previous question about just interactions with politicians, I agree. This is like one issue that you walk in, you actually the lobby visit changes someone's mind on it, because they just are not familiar. Voters and a lot of lawmakers are just not familiar with psychedelics or the research or the science or the potential, and their minds are really changed. And I find people coming over for those legitimate policy reasons and less about, how is this going to help us meet the bottom line or make the budget, which was very much for a lot of cannabis reform from folks that didn't come to it for other reasons. But we do have the challenge of figuring out how to make the regulatory programs try to be cost neutral, at least, if not cost too much.
And even with the bipartisan interest, Juliana, you mentioned going and having an education session. I mean, can you speak to what else could be the delay after, oh, this sounds really cool? What makes it difficult to then move forward. I don't know if you ever get a chance to follow up with those particular politicians, but
Yeah,
it's not they're interested, but want a little bit more than interest.
I mean, Ibogaine has its own particular reasons of why there's pushback. It's very unique in that way because most psychedelics you can't die from, Ibogaine you can. And so that's not really great publicity, especially when you're facing a mainstream drug treatment community that wants to disqualify use of psychedelic substances, period, and is still following the disease of addiction model that's been disproven. So there's a lot of pushback from mainstream addiction treatment field that has a lot of lobbying power. There's a lot of pushback from drug companies who don't want to research something that has cardiac side effects, even though if you actually follow safety protocols, you could entirely avoid those side effects. They don't want to approve a one-time treatment. The Suboxone and methadone interests are really what interfered in the Kentucky effort. And although Suboxone and methadone are amazing tools and need to be more available, they're not the end all be all, and they actually don't work for a lot of people. And they have a lot of influence in hard hit opioid states like Kentucky, who have lifetime customers. They have millions of lifetime customers in this country, and something like Ibogaine really threatens the Suboxone and methadone pharmaceutical interests. So those are just a few of the things that Ibogaine runs up against. But other psychedelics, I think it's the same thing. This is something that might prevent people from getting on psychiatric meds for the rest of their life. And so that's, and this might sound like, ooh, evil big pharma conspiracy, but actually really the motivation of pharmaceutical companies is to have as many customers for as long as possible. And psychedelics really threaten that paradigm.
Absolutely. And the concern about cardiotoxicity, while valid, it's a weak excuse for them to not move forward because the list of FDA-approved medications with the risk of cardiotoxicity is quite long. So, that's a little frustrating that they're pointing out that one thing that actually can be mitigated and has been shown in research to be mitigated with magnesium, and it pretty much eliminates that concern. But moving on. Let's see. So we have a question here about, are you guys aware of how many states have psychedelic task forces evaluating research and potential legality in each of their states? And do you have a list of such? There is a website called Psychedelic Alpha that is tracking that, but I'm wondering if you guys also have some other resources that might offer some more details.
Psychedelic Alpha is a good place to begin that research. It'll tell you which states have, research bills in place, which local jurisdictions are doing what. It's pretty up to date. So I would check out, I think it's called the Legalization and Decriminalization Tracker.
And I'm actually going to look for that and post it in the chat now. In the last few minutes we have, I'm wondering if each of you could share an action item, something small, or an example of a small win that you wouldn't think about as a small win. And the idea is, as individuals, a multidisciplinary group, it'd be great to just take away a little something, whether it's writing a letter, connecting with an advocacy group. So based on your experience, I just would love for you to share some ideas on what the average person can do, again, just to move the needle. Casey, why don't you take it?
All right, I'll go for it. I think the best way, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, I think one of the best ways to move the needle forward is to just talk about drug policy and psychedelics and what your beliefs are and the benefits, the risks, and just be really honest with people about them and just open up the conversation. I think that there's so much deep stigma in this country around drugs that is so embedded in, and we're so indoctrinated in this narrative in our country. And it's really hard to get people to dissociate from that narrative. And so just talking to people, not from a shame place or like a you're wrong, I'm right place, but just like a really honest conversation, I think is probably one of the best and most easy ways that you can cause change.
Thank you. I think
I'll jump on that because I was going to say something similar, but I'll just add in the piece that I feel like lots of times we have these conversations about destigmatizing and having people speak publicly about their experiences. And the lawyer in me is always like, don't don't do that. Like, you're putting yourself at risk if for an individual. I mean, it's very powerful when people do, but I always want people to be very aware of the kind of risk once their story's out to their, legally, but potentially their employment. I mean, there's a lot of different still collateral consequences that come into play. But I do really think that for people who are willing to do that with a full understanding of what it entails, and the one-on-one conversations can be very powerful. We also didn't really talk very much about the harm reduction piece, but I think all these things need a public education component, because as we move towards legalization, more availability, I don't think we have the broader cultural understanding or cultural norms that we need around how to safely use these substances, because a lot of people haven't been using them for a long time. And so I think we need conversations to bring the reform, but we also need conversations as it happens, and once it happens, to make sure people are safe, and we're developing like a shared understanding and shared culture around safety and safe use.
Education amongst ourselves and making sure we're consistent with the messages and evidence base of safety, harm reduction, and just education about how these substances work. Thank you. Casey, Brad, you have any thoughts on small action items?
Juliana, do you want to go first? Otherwise,
Sure.
I'm happy to go first.
I can jump in. I think because we're talking about substance use, I think it's really important that people start learning about how to deconstruct the narratives around substance use, problematic substance use, and regular substance use. And so many people in this society don't even understand what it's about, and that it's a social construct. It's not an individual disease, and that there's many shades of gray in terms of substance use. Read Dr. Collarhart, read Dr. Gabor Mate, listen to harm reductionists, talk to people who use substances, not just psychedelics, because there's often this psychedelic exceptionalism thing that happens where opioid users and stimulant users are left out because they're doing the bad drugs, and it's simply not true. I think we need to center the voices of people who use those substances as well and listen to them to understand that not all substance use is problematic, and it's not a lifelong affliction. The disease model was created by a charlatan, and this, our whole drug treatment system is based on these unresearched false claims, and it's really harmful to people. So I think the best thing that any of us can do is to get educated on what substance use is really about, and how to support people in a collaborative way, and not in a hierarchical, let me tell you what's right and what you need to do kind of way. Like, not telling people they need to stop using, and supporting people and asking them, hey, what do you want to do? So basically what I'm saying is like harm reduction education. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I actually have an action item to share with the group. So we're worried about insurance, but states can actually impose some demands on insurance in terms of what they cover. And so if everyone has the energy, you can write to your local politicians, your state politicians, and just advocate for insurance coverage of psychedelics as they become more available. Just to, again, put it on their radar, send education, ideas about harm reduction, but really just giving them, lending your voice and letting them see that, people do want this treatment, and it would be nice if it was covered by insurance, so that way it could be accessible to others besides the elite. And unfortunately, we're at time, but this was wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to just the energy you bring. And I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm energized to go tear some things up. So thank you all, and everyone. I hope you have a good night. Stay safe, and we will do this again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.